Hello, this is James Cook, Assistant Professor at the University of Maine at Augusta, and this video is being presented for our undergraduate criminology course. Today we're going to take a look back at what we'd thought about last week in terms of biological theories of crime, many of the classical ones of which could easily be ridiculed. Ideas of phrenology and ideas that somehow different racial groups were more likely to engage in crime because they had different brow shapes or different shapes of their chin. Well, they're easy to ridicule because they're, empirically speaking, ridiculous. They were attempts to explain, but their explanations don't match up with observable reality. They've fallen by the wayside, therefore. And for some time in criminology, it therefore was considered a bit laughable to think about biological theories of crime. However, in the past 30 years or so, with the advent of more rigorous statistical methods being used more often, and also the genetic revolution, there has been a renewed emphasis in studies of crime and how it relates to families, and whether or not familial trends in the transmission of crime from one generation to the next have to do with socialization or have to do with something biological. So let's consider that in context, because the sociological has to do with the developmental theories that you read about in this week's class, and which we're jumping off of. But it also has to do with the biological theories we thought about in the last class as well. If there's not something to do with the skull, and if there's not something to do with the shape of your brow or your chin or the width of your nose in determining your crime, could it be something else? Something a bit more subtle? Harriet Wilson notices that crime runs in families in a 1987 study in Birmingham in the UK. She studies 120 families, 47% of which contain a convicted parent. In those families, 45% of the sons of those convicted parents are themselves convicted of a crime in her study. Now, 53% of the families that she studies have no convicted parent. And in families with no convicted parent, only 19% of sons are convicted of a crime. That's a big difference. The percentage of sons convicted of a crime in families with no convicted parent is a lot lower than the percent of sons convicted in families that have a convicted parent. Now, Wilson talks in terms of developmental theories, which you've read about in Anthony Walsh's Criminology, the Essentials textbook. A lot about parental supervision. But what else could it be? There are other reasons that crime might run in families. David Farrington and his colleagues in the Journal of Adolescence in 2001 think about this issue as well. And they reference Harriet Wilson's study, and they move on from that thinking about two of their own studies. One of them is also in the UK, and that's the Cambridge study of delinquent development, in which they make a similar kind of piece of research, and they find that 63% of boys with convicted fathers were themselves convicted, compared to 30% of boys with unconvicted fathers. So the rate of conviction of boys is a lot lower when the fathers are not themselves convicted of a crime. There's something about having a convict father that is associated with the boys in the next generation also being convicted. By the way, why are we talking about fathers and boys? We're talking about that because of the trend, the empirical trend, that males appear to be involved in the criminal justice system as people are being arrested much more often. This means that if you're going to study crime, it's very difficult from a statistical point of view to get a large number of women or girls into your study. So it often is fathers and sons. Not always, but quite often. Now they move across the big pond, across the Atlantic, over to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They find a different set of numbers, usually because they're making measurements and defining their terms in different ways, but with the same pattern. 25.1% of boys with arrested fathers were themselves arrested, but just 6.7% of the boys who don't have arrested fathers were arrested. Again, third time we're studying that difference, once with Harriet Wilson, once in Cambridge, once in Pittsburgh, and we're finding the same trend. Farrington goes on with his colleagues to consider 5 possible explanations. He actually, in his paper, thinks about it in terms of a larger number, but I've collapsed a few categories. Now, one of those is what he calls intergenerational continuities and exposure to multiple risk factors. That sounds really complicated, but it just means that the father's generation and the son's generation, if we're talking about males inheriting this, statistically speaking, are exposed to the same risks. If the father and the son both encounter family poverty, well, they're both more likely to become criminal. If they experience not just family poverty, but poverty in the neighborhood, they're both more likely to become criminal. What if the father has a disrupted family? Well, the child is more likely to have a disrupted family too. What if the father was the product of a single parent or a teenage parent? The child is likely to encounter that as well, or at least more likely. What if there's something about the way that the child was reared, some kind of pattern or behavior that the parents impose upon the children? Well, where do we learn how to parent? We learn it from our parents. So, boy, is that likely to be transmitted on to a kid? Yeah. Intergenerational sameness, continuity, it continues to happen from the parent's generation to the child's generation. Those risk factors are the same. Therefore, boy, both the parent and the child, or if we're talking about studies of males, the father and the son, are at an elevated risk for criminality. That's one possible reason why. It has to do with the social environment. Another possibility having to do with the social environment is that family members influence and imitate one another. Whether it's from a parent to a child, or siblings imitating one another, we learn how to be people by watching people in our families to a significant extent. And that could be happening inside of families. It could also be that families are being profiled. Have you ever heard stories about, oh, that Jenkins kid in town, right? Oh, we know about the Jenkinses, right? And so the teachers always are looking out for Jenkins to get in trouble, and so Jenkins goes to detention more often, and Jenkins starts a developmental track that leads to Jenkins going to jail. Whereas, if you've ever gone to school, which I'm sure most of you have, that there are these golden children who none of the teachers ever think could ever do anything wrong, and they get away with murder. Well, not literally with murder, we hope, but they get away with a lot of things because nobody looks at them. Could these be reasons why in a parent's generation and then in a child's generation there's either a transmission of criminality or the lack of criminality? Yeah, depending on how people pay attention to the family. Then there's what Farrington and his colleagues colorfully refer to as assortative mating, meaning people don't just randomly marry other people or outside of wedlock have children with other people. People mate with, have children with people who are like themselves. Criminals could choose to marry other criminals. They might like that about other people. They might use it in different words. Say, I'm looking for a rebel, like me. Or it could be that criminals just are more likely to meet other criminals, and they do so in crime-promoting environments. Maybe you hang out in a crack house enough, you might meet someone you like, and maybe you'll have a kid together. If you don't hang out in a crack house, well, but you hang out in other places, like a coffee shop or a university library, or maybe you work at a police department, you'd be more likely to run into other people in that setting who are less criminal, certainly, than the people in the crack house, and who might actually have an aversion to crime. So, with those two possibilities, two people are going to marry and or mate with two very different people. And then you will have two parents who are going to end up creating all these influences, introducing all these biases against the kid. Oh, he's from that family, the Jenkins. Oh, you think the dad's bad? Wait till you check out the mom. Or all these intergenerational continuities and exposure to multiple risk factors, like neighborhood poverty and disrupted families. Finally, there's a possibility of a genetic mechanism or some other kind of biological heritability. Consider that it's not just genes we pass on, it's the experience of being in the womb, it's the experience of nutrition in the womb, all sorts of other kinds of things we pass on to our kids even before they breathe their first breath. We often think of it in terms of genetics, but there's other kinds of heritability out there. There are two approaches to studying biological heritability in criminology and more broadly in the sociological study of deviance or antisocial behavior. The first is twin studies. So in twin studies, researchers take advantage of this idea that there are two kinds of twins out there: monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins. Now, I'm a monozygotic twin. There's somebody else out there in the world who is pretty much genetically similar to me, although there are some mutations that occur early on in development that lead to less than 100% genetic similarity. It's very close, though. And that monozygotic twin of mine and me, well, we came from the same egg. And then we developed into, briefly, a single zygote that then split into two embryos. We're almost genetically identical. If there were a genetic test, if my twin brother committed a murder where he lives, I might be fingered, genetically speaking. That's actually a practical problem given how many twins there are out in the world and how many crimes there are in the world. If you use genetic profiling, you might nab the wrong twin, especially if they're monozygotic twins who are nearly genetically identical. Dizygotic twins, though, develop from two separate eggs. Two separate eggs coming from the same mother, and most of the time, two sperms coming from the same man. Now, on average, they have about 50% of their genetics that are shared. About half. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower, but far lower than 100%. But once they leave the womb, here's the thing, they're both twins. They both have the experience of having someone the same age as they are in the family, which is unusual and worth noting. They are both reared at the same time in their parents' life cycle. They experience the same house, especially in these studies where monozygotic twins are typically raised together and dizygotic twins are measured as raised together. And the question is, if you have a pair of twins that shares more genetics and a pair of twins that shares fewer genetics, are the monozygotic twins more likely to engage in similar criminal behavior? If so, we might be able to say that there's heritability there. The second approach is an adoption study. And it asks, okay, what's the effect of biological parents' criminal record? Well, if you had a kid and your kid stayed with you after that kid was born, you might possibly teach that kid something. You might feed that kid different food. You might, expose them to varying levels of lead around your house, all kinds of things that you might impart upon your child. But what if your child is separated from you at birth? Does your criminal record have anything to do with that kid's criminal record? You didn't teach that kid anything. You were separated at birth. What could possibly, if there's an association, lead to a similarity between biological parents and the children's behavior when their children are separated from the parent at birth? Something heritable. These are the two approaches, and we're going to take a look at some data regarding them. And when we do that, we're going to think about the idea of concordance. We'll also express it as correlation in a minute. But concordance is the chance that if one of a pair of individuals exhibits a trait or a behavior, that the other member of the pair will exhibit the same trait or behavior. Like blue eyes. Okay, among monozygotic twins, there's just about a 100% concordance of blue eyes. That is, I have blue eyes, okay? And what's the chance that my twin brother, my monozygotic twin brother, also has blue eyes, excuse me? Well, it's just about 100%. Okay, that kind of thing, blue eyes, unless they're wearing contacts, okay? We're talking about the natural color of your eyes, it's about 100%. That's an inherited factor. Is criminality like blue eyes? Is it an inherited trait? If so, we'd expect a concordance that's up about at 100%. What about 50% concordance? Well, that would be reasonably high. That would say then if person X over here is a criminal, then the twin over here, person Y, is a criminal about half of the time too. Or maybe if person X and person Y are a biological father and the kid that then gets adopted by someone else, a 50% concordance between them would say, hey, when the biological parent is a father, then the kid, who never sees the biological father, is about half the time going to be a criminal too. That's what concordance measures. Is concordance higher for monozygotic twins than for dizygotic twins? Is concordance higher for biological parents and someone else versus biological parents who don't have that trait and someone else, the kid? Let's take a look. Let's find out. Carl Christensen does a pretty classic twin study in 1970. And so we're going to look at some classic studies first. He looks at about 6,000 pairs of male twins, and he finds 67 pairs in them in which at least one was registered as a criminal in Denmark. Okay, now in 36% of those pairs, 24 of them in other words, out of the pairs where one was a criminal, both were criminals. So the concordance rate is 36%. 36% of the time where one of them is a criminal, the other's a criminal too. Doesn't sound too high. But among male fraternal twins, these are the dizygotic twins, the ones that came from two different eggs, out of 114 pairs where at least one was registered as a criminal, only 14, had a concordance where both were registered as a criminal in the country of Denmark. That's a concordance rate of only 12%. There's a higher concordance rate for both fraternal and identical twins for more serious crimes, a lower concordance rate for less serious crimes. This seems to support the idea that monozygotic twins, because they're more likely to have concordance in criminality, that criminality is somewhat inherited. It also seems to suggest that crime is not a matter of 100% heritability, because concordance is not 100%. It's not completely determined by your biology. Something else kicks in. Biology does have, apparently, a role to play in this study. There are some problems with twin studies. We could ask ourselves, could it be due to the fact that identical twins have a more similar environment? Are they dressed the same? Do parents perhaps, treat them more similarly than they treat fraternal twins because they look alike? Might be. There's no problem with birth order. There's no problem with the age at your critical events, but there might be a difference in how your parent treats you. And if there is a difference in how your parent treats you based on whether you're fraternal twins or identical twins, then that might have something to do with concordance. So there's a little bit of a problem with twin studies, at least hypothetically there. We could take a look at adoption studies, however, which tries to control for those environmental problems. Sarnoff-Mednick does a series of studies, the most significant one of which is in Science. Here's the citation right here. And So that's a pretty big publication. Science is a very large, prestigious journal, studying a number of circumstances, pairs of fathers and sons. So studies biological fathers and boys who are delinquent and not delinquent. Okay, this happens when the child is adopted away and the biological father doesn't have contact. Okay, let's read down the columns. So you notice 69 and 31 in the first column, that totals to 100%. 51 and 49% in the second column sums to 100%. So we would then interpret those numbers as meaning of boys who are not delinquent, well, 61% have a father who's not criminal, and only 31% have a father who's criminal. Of the boys who are delinquent, on the other hand, 49% have a biologically criminal father, a biological father who's criminal, rather, which is almost a 50% rate. That's 18% higher among delinquent boys than among non-delinquent boys. You notice there's no 100% in these cells, which indicates that there's something about the way the boys are raised that is not reduced or reducible to the biological father. It also suggests maybe the biological mother has something to do with this too, if we're thinking about heritable effects, but Hutchings and Mednick didn't think about that one. Biological fathers appear to influence boys' criminality, but the environment does as well, because there's not a 100% effect. If there was, we would expect that 100% of the boys who are not delinquent would have non-delinquent fathers, and 100% of the boys who were delinquent would have delinquent fathers. Here's another graph that's describing the difference between violent offenses and non-violent offenses from the Uniform Crime Report's perspective. Right, violent versus property offenses. And they take a look at 14,427 adoptees and compare the criminal records of the adoptees with those of their biological and the adoptive parents. And here's a graph, this figure 1, that's talking about the percent of the adoptees, the sons, biological sons, who are convicted of either violent or non-violent crimes as a function of the number of the biological parents' convictions. So, what do we see here? I have a word here that says significant and a word here that says non-significant. If you look at there is a slight increase for violent offenses, that as parents have more convictions of their own, biological ones, there's a slight tick up in the percent of sons who are convicted of violent offenses. But it's so small that Mednick and Gabrielli and Hutchings make the conclusion that it's possible that that might be due to chance. On the other hand, if you look at property offenses, that is, taking cars, snatching purses, okay, taking people's property, there's a large and significant increase. The more convictions that a biological parent has, the higher the percent of convicted sons, the higher percent of the time that the sons are themselves, convicted of property violations. So that looks like heritability for property offenses, possibly not for violent offenses. So there's a classical adoption study back in the 1980s, almost 30 years ago. Okay. So if you look, what about adoptive parents, right? Do they have an effect? Well, in this table, we could look at the percent of boys in each circumstance. There are 4 possibilities who have a criminal record. Among boys who have adoptive parents who are not criminal and biological parents who are also not criminal, there you have the lowest rate of criminality among boys, just 13.5% of them. Okay. If you then head down in that first column to adoptive parents who are not criminal and biological parents who are criminal, you get a jump of 7.5%. All of a sudden, if biological parents are criminal, adoptive parents are not criminal, the boys are more likely to be criminal themselves. But also notice that the rate is somewhat low for all groups. And the fact that you have neither adoptive nor biological parents who are criminal doesn't take away completely the risk that you yourself might have a criminal record. It's been 20 to 30 years since these classic studies, 40 in the case of Christensen, my goodness. There have, in that time, been over 100 replications. Now, what are the results of those replications? Fortunately, Soo-Hyun Ri and Erwin Waldman in 2002 did a really thorough meta-analysis, which means that they looked at over 100 studies, and they tried to summarize in just a few graphs the correlation between one person being a criminal and another person being a criminal. They looked at both twin studies and adoption studies. And instead of concordance, they used a measure called a correlation. A correlation occurs between a -1 and a 1. So there are a few things to look at here. The first is that, and if you've taken research methods, which I certainly hope you have, you'll know that when there's a 0 correlation, that means that there's no effect of person X's criminality on person Y's criminality. There's just no effect. That's what a 0 means. If there's a positive correlation, then that's a positive effect, as you read in the article How to Read a Research Paper earlier in the semester. Remember that a positive effect means that, in this case, when one person is a criminal in the pair, Y is more often going to be criminal as well. A negative correlation, that is going to be a number that is between 0 and -1, means that there's a negative effect. And remember from How to Read a Research article earlier in the semester, you know that in this case it would mean, if we're talking about criminality, that when person X is a criminal, Y would be less often a criminal. That would be a negative effect. X's criminality would make Y tend to be less criminal. Well, we're almost done with the video here. Let's take a look and see what the results are for these 100 studies done by others and summarized by Ri and Waldman. Okay, first, let's look at adoption studies. You have 4 rows of figures, okay, summarized in this graph. The purple row describes the number of correlations found in studies in which the pair was a child and the child's adopted sibling, adopted brother or sister. Is there a relationship between the two of them? Well, let's take a look. There is no study that finds a negative correlation, a correlation of -0.01 or less. There are some studies that show a positive correlation, but they tend to be relatively low, either 0 to 0.09 or 0.1 to 0.19. That's where most of the correlations lie there. Similarly, if we're looking at the relationship between an adopted child and an adopted parent, an adoptive parent, the parent who adopts, the social relationship between the adopted child and the adopted parent does seem to have an effect, but sometimes it seems to be negative. A little more often it seems to be positive. It's never very high. There are no studies in which there's a strong high correlation that's positive. That's really kind of mixed in determining its effect. On the other hand, if we look at a child and their biological sibling, that's the green row, notice there are a lot of correlations that are higher in number. And what about between an adopted child and their biological parent who is no longer in their life? Well, oh goodness, there are some very high correlations and some moderate ones. This seems to indicate, this meta-analysis, that the biological relationship is stronger than the social relationship in a family in determining antisocial behavior, which, as you'll notice in the lower right, is not just about criminality, but also about psychiatric diagnoses of antisocial behaviors and syndromes, and also findings of aggressive behavior that perhaps might not rise to the level of a crime. Both of these are associated with antisocial diagnosis in psychiatry and aggressive behavior with later criminality. Twin studies, okay, correlations. There are 92 studies looked at here. DZ twins means dizygotic twins that came from different eggs. Monozygotic twins means one zygote that split from the same egg. Where are the correlations higher? In between one twin's antisocial behavior, again, could be psychiatric diagnosis, could be criminal or delinquent behavior, or could be aggressive behavior. Where's the correlation higher between one twin's behavior and another? Well, it's higher between monozygotic twins, a higher correlation than between dizygotic twins. If you look at the general pattern among 92 studies, all in this one graph, there is a positive association for dizygotic twins too, but it's higher for monozygotic twins, who share a higher proportion of their genetic code. They also, this is an interesting point at which we can think about the difference between the amniotic experience, right, of perhaps receiving the same nutrition levels. The dizygotic twins are together in the womb as well, but what's the difference here? The difference is in the amount of genetics. And this does seem to suggest that there is some kind of genetic heritability that has to do with crime. But you'll see at the end of each of these reports, up to the current day, a whole lot of hesitancy about exactly figuring out what that is. Does it have to do with perhaps some hypothetical gene for risk-taking? Is there some other genetic basis for it? To be honest, biologists have not really focused on either one definitive gene or a definitive set of genes to answer that question. It's a question that is unanswered. The final thing to notice, however, is that in none of these cases none of the studies is the correlation at its highest possible level, 1.0. Most of the time it's less than 0.5, which means that something else is entering into the picture. It's important for us to note that there seems to be some kind of biological basis that pushes some people toward criminality more than others, but there's a whole lot left that happens after someone's born in their social experience, either in their family or in their neighborhood or in their other associations. We'll continue to talk about crimes, moving toward the specific subjects of violent crime and then property crime in oncoming weeks, but I hope I've given you something to think about here as it relates to the connection between development and possible heritability of crime. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.